Okay, so we're going to talk about designing with thematic power today, which is one of the most exciting subjects for me. It's something I've been studying for more than a decade, and it's the more I study, the more I get excited about it. I really feel like this is something that you can't master too much. You could probably spend the rest of your life on it. And so I'm going to show you all the stuff that I've discovered about it that I think it's pretty cool. So all right, so first question is why theme? Why should you be trying to introduce theme into your work? First of all, the best are using it. A lot of the studios that I've worked at that are kind of at the top of their game are thinking about this stuff. They may not be using the term theme, but they're thinking about all the components that make theme work. Second of all, it saves you pain, saves me so much pain, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the things that some of the pain that it avoids. One of the things is iteration time, and third, you're probably already using it anyway. You just don't know how to control it. You don't have full power. You're not leveraging the power of what theme can do for you yet, because theme is not really a separate tool. It's not a thing outside of what you do. It's just something that you have that when you're creating art, it's just there with you, and it's just an issue of whether you're doing something with it or not. So I pulled in this example from an artist, and we're going to talk a little bit about it. But let's define theme as I'm going to talk about it today, because there's a lot of different ways you can think about theme. It's like you can have like a princess themed wedding or something like that, but that's not really the way that we're talking about it. So theme is the way that I'm talking about it is an expression of the visual ideas in a piece and how those ideas interact to communicate what that piece is really all about. And I picked this art by just kind of a random artist out of the folders that artists that I follow, Sung Choi. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, because I wanted to show that even though I don't know anything about this, you can see, I don't know the artist that did it. I just know that the piece works and it's beautiful, and I want to show you part of the reason why it works. Obviously, it's rendered well and it's drawn well, and that is always important. But the thing that gives this piece power comes from theme. So you'll notice that this piece actually has two main components: this feeling of kind of danger and death and kind of this hollow, empty quality. And then it has this sort of warm, friendly jaunt in the desert sort of feeling. Little guy there with his rover companion on an alien world. And when you put those two ideas together, those two ideas kind of jitter against each other and create something really exciting. So we'll talk about specifically how to use this, but the feeling that you get as you pull that together, the excitement that comes as you pull those ideas together, and obviously the rendering is going to bring some of that, but ultimately it's the story of the piece. That's what theme is. Theme is just an expression of the story and a specific aspect of the story. So how do you build theme? First of all, you're going to start with contrasting ideas. In up, you have idea one, which is and by the way, I'm labeling these idea one and idea two. This isn't anything official. This is just the way that I want you to think about theme, and the things that I've found that you can boil theme down to its most simple form and then leverage the power of it most easily. So idea one, in this case being the balloon, which is used all throughout up, and then idea two, which is the ballast or the weight underneath the balloon. And that's all of the visuals in up are based around interactions of these two ideas. Maybe not all of them, but anything that's impactful in the film is leveraging the quality of these two things, not just the shapes, but the quality of what it means to be uplifted and to be free and to be weighted and heavy and immobile. So once you have those contrasting ideas, it's important to recognize that any symbol can actually communicate multiple ideas. And it's totally fine to just pick the one that's your favorite that you think it should describe, and then you're going to use reinforcing symbols in order to maximize the power of that. So once you've got those two ideas and you kind of know what symbols they're going to represent, what you're going to do is figure out the relationship between those two ideas. The two ideas by themselves and their contrasting quality is not the theme. You don't have a theme until you figure out what the relationship is. What does idea one do to idea two? Or what does idea two do back to idea one? And when you have this, what you have is a theme. A theme gives you, first of all, hierarchy. You know what's important, what's less important. You know what's the contextual idea and what's the modifying idea, which idea is working in what way. You know what forces are at work in the piece, and we're going to talk about visual forces in a minute. You will have a unified quality, which is actually one of the biggest advantages of theme. People worry all the time about style and finding style. I've been on projects where I was hired explicitly to try and find a style for the thing that I was working on, and the style, if you're just looking for style as just kind of this arbitrary sort of random search, it's very, very difficult. But if you look at style through the lens of theme, you can actually find something that gives you the unifying quality of style, but with all of the power that comes with theme. And finally, the power that comes with this is the clear message. You get this message in your work. Even if the viewers don't know your theme, it's never stated explicitly, they get it. They feel it in their hearts as they look at your image, watch your animation, whatever else it is that you're creating. So we're going to talk about how you use theme to improve on a design. And first of all, I started with this image. It was something that I was using Adobe Fresco and trying out their oil painting brushes, and I had a photo off of Earth's World, and I just started painting, and it was mostly just the head area, and I started extrapolating from that and just kind of throwing random things in there. And when I was done with it, I felt like it doesn't really work, right? The image doesn't work that well, but there's some things that I really like about it, and I felt like those things, the qualities that were strong in it, I wanted to kind of pull those forward and turn it into a character design. So first of all, you look for idea number one, and what I'm going to do is look for all of the components of this design that kind of support one quality. So I noticed all these kind of like hook shapes and these sort of aggressive, almost like barreling train or automobile sort of things, this sort of aggressiveness of the hook, this sort of like club-like quality, these lines that can have these aggressive turns to them. And the word that I came to describe those symbols, and by the way, you don't always need words. It's totally fine if you don't have a word to describe something, to just start figuring out the symbols that all kind of have shared qualities. That's good enough, because whether you have the word or not isn't that important. What matters is that you are recognizing what shared qualities, what symbols kind of share the same energy through the piece. So I gave this one kind of the word of aggressive or brutish, and I think that describes kind of what these motifs are doing. Some of the colors are kind of supporting this aggressive and brutish quality as well. Then I felt like there is this sort of cheery, happy, and fairy-like idea that I saw repeated in the shoulders, on the back, and even just there's the occasional little thing going on with like the light colors in the shirt and sort of the fluffy quality of the shirt, that I just felt like it's kind of cheery, it's happy, there's this fairy-like quality. And I liked the fact that these two ideas contrasted against each other. I felt like the bright colors played into that. Even like, there's this sort of like polka dotted quality when you look at the collars, that I felt there's something fun and playful even just about that pattern. And so those are going to be the two symbols, the two visual ideas that I use to describe this piece. So taking those two ideas, now we don't have a theme yet. We have to figure out the interaction between them. And it doesn't matter right now that we know which direction it's working, but we're going to look to see, is there a way that things could work in this piece? And sometimes, especially if you're starting with a design that doesn't really have an emotional charge to it or doesn't have a direction to it yet, the best thing to do is to just pick something. And in this case, I started looking at these two ideas and saying, is the aggressive brutish idea interacting on the cheery happy fairy-like idea? Is the aggressive idea here, is it stamping down or weighing down or something to that cheery happy fairy-like thing? Is it aggressively attacking it? Something like that. Or is the cheery happy fairy-like quality of this design kind of pushing back and illuminating and lifting and all that stuff. And I thought in this case, I was just going to pick one. It doesn't matter which I pick, just as long as I'm consistent afterward once I start designing it. So I'm going with lifting, and you can see the cheery, happy, fairy-like is lifting the aggressive, brutish qualities. There's some symbols that I think we can use with that. The balloon, something that's being pulled upward, even just vertical moving strokes, arrows, other things like that. And of course, the light colors do a good job of that as well. So now we can start iterating. We have our theme. We know we've aggressive and brutish is going to be lifted now by this cheery, happy, or fairy-like thing. First exploration that I do redesigning this character is thinking about how do we get the aggressive and brutish thing, repeating that idea around. And repeating motifs is really important. You want to make sure that your symbols are everywhere, especially when you've got a sort of contextual idea. Right here, the aggressive, brutish idea, it is the main idea. That's what the majority of this character is all about. And then the cheery, happy, fairy-like lifting that's happening is going to be a modifying idea. It's going to take that context and do a little spin on it. And that, in this case, I just need to really push the aggressive across the design. Then we do another take. This time I'm trying to introduce, we got the aggressive, I think, in that previous design. This time trying to push the aggressive a little bit, but also trying to introduce some of the cheery, happy, fairy-like components. Put some polka dots on the pants. Tried to make it so that it felt like the character was lifting up, almost like a balloon overall. And then trying to push even maybe some of those corners into these softer shapes to just lift some of that aggressiveness even more. And in the end, ended up with this design, which I finished off, and you can see hopefully that design or this theme is being represented in that design. And we started with this thing that isn't really working. It was just me messing around and ended up with a fairly successful character design. This is iteration number 5, and so I'd probably do a bunch more iterations if I was really going to push a character, but I was in a hurry to prep things for this. What's interesting also about this is that you could show this to somebody and you could ask them, what kind of ideas are you getting from this? When you look at this, what is it making you think about? What's it making you feel? And they're actually going to start bringing up thematic components. We didn't have to tell them what the aggressive brutish thing is being lifted by this cheery, happy, fairy-like thing. What's interesting here is that we don't get to decide exactly how that interaction plays out in this. This character doesn't look super friendly. The aggressive brutish thing is not being successfully lifted by the cheery, happy, and fairy-like stuff, even though those things are attempting to lift the design. And I think that's pretty awesome. I love that theme will actually introduce this organic quality of discovery in your designs as you work. All right. So just one thing to watch out for is that the style is actually part of the story. In this version, we had the style was pushing towards something that was supposed to be kind of fun and playful, maybe a little bit more appropriate for a TV or feature film animation. And if we were to make something, say, for a teenage boy video game, and we want something that's really aggressive and maybe even kind of push in the darkness a little bit, there's no way that we're going to get this lifting quality out of that. And so it's important to recognize the theme may have to change because the story is changing. When you actually change the style, you change the story, and the theme has to kind of shift to accommodate for that story shift. And so in this case, I actually made it so that there is an attempt at lifting up, but ultimately the cheery, happy, fairy-like stuff is being weighed down by the aggressive and brutish stuff. It feels even more like a facade than what we had going on here. So one more note I want to talk about is that throughout the world of design and throughout nature, there's this idea of self-similarity. And anytime that you're going to be applying design principles, you want to think about applying them at every level. At the top level, where you're looking at the big silhouette and shape of the design, all the way down to the micro details, the shape of, the eyelid and the pupil and all that stuff. So when you're thinking about this idea, I always like to remember this adage, which I got from the Disney feature modeling team. They said they always use this phrase, the lesser is to the greater as the greater is to the whole. Is just a good way to remember self-similarity. You're looking at the lesser components and do they match what's going on thematically, design-wise, with the whole. And just to give you an expression of this, so if we were to take a theme like poisoned by power, we could actually apply that using a number of motifs, figure out how they interact, and then we can apply all that stuff now to the design. And you'll notice here there's kind of like this creepy castle that's got this poisoned by power uh, thing going on. It's happening with various different motifs in different ways. What I like about this is that when you look at the larger silhouette, you get this sort of poisoned by power quality. When you get into a closer feature like a sconce that a flame, a torch is going to be in, it continues that idea. But what's interesting is that it's being expressed in slightly different ways. And then when we get down to maybe like the texture on the door, we can still have that exact same idea, but now it's going to be expressed very differently. And this idea of understanding what theme is and applying it lesser as the greater as the greater as the whole, this isn't just taking a motif and populating it so that we see, there's rectangles when it's big and there's rectangles when it's small, but we get the idea of a rectangle and the component of a rectangle being stable. And maybe when we get to the lowest level, when we're looking at the texture on something, then we're no longer looking at the rectangularity of it, but we're actually just looking at the idea of stability and how that expresses. And we'll talk more about this afterward. But I want to talk really quickly about how do you extract a theme from complicated designs. And this happens all the time. So it's rare that you want to start with theme. In fact, I would highly recommend against it. Sometimes theme will generate ideas, but in my experience, it's actually really, really negative in most cases to be trying to do concept work, to design something, to be modeling something, and to be thinking about theme ahead of time. It's actually better to just kind of follow your heart and to try to tell the story the best way you know, and then afterward say, okay, we've got all this stuff that I like, or we've got all this stuff that the art director likes, now what's the theme? So let's talk about and teach how to do that. So I'm going to take some designs from Brave, some of the final character models posed, and we're going to try to extract from this at this point. Hopefully you won't get this far down into production before realizing, oh my goodness, we don't have a theme, we don't know what's going on. So we're going to try to extract a theme. Now these characters are very complicated. There's a lot of stuff going on, a lot of forces going on, a lot of ideas, visual ideas going on. And so sorting through those ideas, you don't want to just dive into the simplest stuff. Like this is the way that I've described theme, right? We have idea one, and it's good to find a single idea for idea one if you can. We have idea two, again, good to find a single idea for idea two, and then to find whatever action is happening. But in reality, when you deal with a situation like this with these really, really complicated characters and all this interesting design stuff that's going on, you rarely end up with a single idea, a single idea two, and a single action. Usually there's going to be a little bit more of a complicated interaction between those. So best way to do it at this point, I will just start pulling out stuff that I find common. Qualities that are common, like we have roughness that's kind of showing up again. We have things that are occasionally being kind of loosely constrained, even with that hair that's happening. We get this sort of like wildernessy vibe, this living off the land. The practical or real thing that I'm referencing there is just that, like, it's not just the fact that everything feels real or that the rendering of things feel real, but there's this kind of dealing with the nitty gritties of life. The physicality of everything is being emphasized here. We have motifs of things being either wound or woven in or being intertwined. We have these kind of like his peg leg that's not just history, personal history thing, but it's actually got this sense of wildness and craziness to it. We have untamed, which you might notice there's some similar things kind of coming out here. We have certain components that are kind of bursting out at the seams. We have other ideas, like there's these kind of archetypal fairy tale elements that go across. We have these traditional things that are themes in the story that we can kind of see happening across the characters. We have things that are being bound, tightened up, the sort of properness of the mother and kind of the attempts to bring in properness elsewhere in the world. And of course, like this sort of extreme order that's showing up on her. Okay, so we have all these ideas. It's okay to bring up an idea that shows up in a single character here, by the way, but it's best to pull up things that are true across all the characters. Now we're going to take all this stuff and we're going to say which of these things actually are kind of saying the same thing. They don't have to say exactly the same thing, but if we were to put them all into a box and categorize them according to how similar they are to one another, what would that box look like? And so pulling a bunch of these things together, the stuff that feels like it's kind of touching on this idea of the wild wilderness and the physicality of the world and kind of this, yeah, just the craziness that's going on in Brave. Then we've got some of these other things, and I forgot to do an arrow here for intertwining, but we have all the things that are kind of constrained, controlled, the sense of order, things are being proper. I put all those into the same box because they felt like they were kind of nudging towards the same idea. All right, so now we have our two main ideas. Now, these aren't singular ideas, they're kind of these complicated ideas, but we can categorize the visual ideas into these kind of groups. Now, we don't have an action yet. And we've used everything basically here, and it's not, we can't say archetypal fairy tale goes in here, we can't say tradition goes in here, the things that we haven't used. That doesn't really work. What I want to point out is that some of these things, bursting at seams and intertwining, even just like the idea of constraining, those are actually actions. Those aren't just a an, a noun, right? If you were writing a sentence out, those aren't nouns and subjects, those are verbs. And so if we take those ideas and move them into the center instead, it might be interesting just to kind of see what happens. Now, these ideas right here, I think it's important to understand that I've got multiple ideas, and the ideas actually interact in different ways. The rough, untamed, earthy, practical stuff is not doing stuff to these things in an intertwining way. What it's doing is bursting at the seams. So these are the seams, and this stuff is bursting at the seams through these designs. Likewise, this kind of proper bound constrained stuff, it's not bursting at the seams for that. That's not what it's doing. When you look across these designs, what it's trying to do is control. It's trying to take this stuff and say, hold on a second, let's hold on and just everybody calm down a little bit here. So it's kind of intertwining and wrapping and calming and whatever else, right? So this our theme actually kind of crosses over. We have this idea that is interacting in that way, these ideas that are interacting in that way. So when in the end, we've got a couple of ideas like the archetypal fairy tale components and the traditional components. I think it's fine to keep thinking about those. In fact, it's actually really important. But I'm crossing them out here because we're not actually going to try to make those part of our theme. We're not going to try and squeeze it in. And I'm going to give something from Ed Catmull's book that I think is a really important thing to remember when you're dealing with theme. He said that when companies come up with themes or catchphrases or whatever else to kind of help motivate people, what they'll do is they've spent all this time on this project trying to figure out which direction are we going, what references are we coming from, what type of story are we trying to tell, what types of things are make us excited, and eventually there's this big complicated mess of things that kind of makes up the identity of the thing that you're creating. And Ed Catmull says what happens is then people, they turn that into a theme, they figure out, okay, this stuff already all boils down to this idea, and then they'll pass that thing on to the team as this easy trite little statement that you can easily send around to other people and say, here's our theme, here's our theme, here's our theme, here's our catchphrase, whatever. And what happens is, it's like, this is again going to Ed Catmull, he says that it's like you have this suitcase that's just full of stuff, and then you pick it up and walk out the room with the handle. The handle breaks off the suitcase and you just walk out with the handle, and you don't actually have the suitcase with you anymore. And so when you're either creating theme or you're trying to discover theme in your work, it's really, really important that you don't take just the handle. Take the whole suitcase. Sometimes that means that you end up with something a little bit messier like this. You don't end up with something that is simple and easy to pass along, but you have something that's rich and full of energy and life and influences that are exciting and stuff like that. So don't necessarily get rid of the archetypal fairy tale elements. Don't get rid of the tradition and how the tradition of the parents are being passed on to the children. don't get rid of that stuff. Keep it. It just doesn't end up being the thing that you go to first when you're designing. It ends up being something that you kind of pull in around the corners. And so I would argue, some might disagree with me in the world, but I'm going to argue strongly and firmly that this is a theme. You do not need a trite and simple, easy to pass along sentence to have a theme. You just need to know what the interaction between ideas are in your world. I know theme also has a story component. We're going to talk about what a story theme is. This is all about a visual theme. And I think a visual theme, it's this. This is what it is. You don't need something super simple. And once you've got these sort of alignments worked out, it actually becomes really powerful. And now you could go design another character from Brave, and you know what it's made out of. You know the things, the visual elements that drive this world, because you were able to study those designs and figure out what's going on. Okay, so let's talk about another problem that comes up with theme. Say, I've run into this lots of times, right? So, somebody will design a character and they'll say, this character has this very obvious theme, but it doesn't necessarily apply to other things. So let's take an example. Here's a character that I designed. This is like a decade ago that I designed this character. And I look at it now and I think, man, the idea is just, it's not that great. It's okay. But there's still something there, right? There's still something about that design, and I think I want to expand a little bit on this world, which, by the way, is a great practice. Go back to the things that you've done in years past and return to it and try to figure out, how does it work? What works about it, and how can I now leverage that and pull it forward? That's exactly what theme is good for. So in this case, we're going to try and figure out what the theme is for this character, and then we're going to try to apply it to some very different characters. So if I'm just looking at visual elements, I kind of get this like floppy egg thing, right? It's like a soft boiled egg or something that's kind of like bending and flopping, or like a jello egg or something like that. And then I'm also getting these sort of like, it's almost like a rounded toothpick or something like that is kind of the feeling I'm getting. So those are kind of the two visual ideas I'm seeing repeated here. And if I'm looking at it in terms of like, okay, what are these two shapes doing to each other? It feels like it's like somebody took the toothpick thing and poked it into the egg, but only just barely. They didn't actually shove it all the way in. They just kind of put it in. It's kind of loosely dangling there, right? And so there's our theme for this character. Now it's not perfectly the theme, because what we've actually discovered here are not thematic ideas. We haven't converted it into language yet. Here's the problem here, is that I've noticed two visual motifs that have been repeated, but I don't actually know what the driving ideas behind these visual motifs yet. And I can't really take this anywhere else until I know that, because otherwise all I can do is copy that motif. I can copy the egg, I can copy the toothpick, that's it. But if I know why an egg and I know why a toothpick, then I can actually take this somewhere. So here's our problem, and I just want to show you why we need to discover those things. So now we've got this, and we want to throw another character into this world. And we're going to say, this is the dashing lantern-jawed hero. How do we apply these ideas to a dashing lantern-jawed hero without actually having it fight against the fact that they're a hero, make the design process actually more difficult? Second of all, another character we're going to look at here is we're going to say it's this doctor, that he created this giant Frankenstein creature. And so again, if he's going to create a giant hulking Frankenstein creature, how do you apply the visual theme we came up here, which is mostly motifs and kind of figuring out their relationship to that? Well, let's kind of dig in. One of the qualities that I see with this floppy egg thing is it's kind of soft and squishy. And what's interesting is there's other components like the asymmetry here that's kind of pushing the soft and squishy. The barely stuck in thing, of course, we'll look at that and how that applies. And then the way that it's being used in these designs, these little toothpick things, they actually just kind of make the character feel weak, like he's just not really that good at his job. And so the idea of those being kind of like the weak manipulators I thought was interesting. So if that becomes kind of now our expanded theme, we're not just saying like what motifs are there, but what ideas are kind of sitting underneath those motifs. Why do those motifs exist in the design? So I'm going to plug those all in and say, all right, what if I were to take this motif and make a sentence, what's the sentence saying? In other words, what's the meaning of something soft and squishy with weak manipulators that are barely stuck in? What is that? Well, it's ineffective, is what it is, right? It's incompetent. That's the idea here. And once I understand that, when I understand what the theme is saying, if it were, again, a sentence, what's that sentence saying? What does the sentence mean? It's ineffective or incompetent. Well, I can take that and convert that now into symbols for ineffectiveness and incompetence. So here's some symbols that I've found as I've worked years designing. Tiny hands and feet is a great way to show ineffectiveness or incompetence. Any wild asymmetry or proportions that are kind of wild gives a sense of incompetence. Floppy, like anything floppy is going to feel like it just doesn't work, right? Think about a rubber glove and trying to do something with a rubber glove that your fingers aren't in. Unfocused eyes, they do a good job of just kind of making it feel like that character mentally isn't there. A physique that's unsuited to the job the character is supposed to do is a great symbol for that. A character that has the right tools but the wrong attitude can be really effective at showing incompetence. And that's going to come down to gesture and expression as much as it is the design elements. Things that don't quite connect. So any design components that feel like they should connect, but they're just not quite there. I actually think a great example of this is looking at his neck. It's like the floppy egg kind of sitting in an egg holder. And it's like it does connect, but it doesn't feel like it's going to be super sturdy. And I love that. And I think that's a great thing that you could pull into other designs, this idea of things that don't quite connect. A little ugliness in everything. I know ugliness can take on a lot of forms, so I'm thinking specifically about the sort of like funny ugly, a character that's just ugly in a way that feels like, I don't know, it's just like nobody's going to like them, nobody's going to think they're great, and you kind of love them anyway for it. I think that's exactly the type of ugliness that I think you want to go for here. Another thing that we don't see as much on this, because he's actually got this massive kind of brain cage on top of his head, but the idea of characters having a small skull, meaning that they're going to have a small brain, is very useful. And actually, when I was doing this design, I pinched the top of his head to kind of push that idea a little bit, even though I wanted him to have that sort of brainiac quality. So this is, to me, this is exciting. I hope that you hear this and you're thinking like, man, this is really exciting, because now we actually have this whole set of symbols that came from understanding the meaning behind the theme. And now that I understand the meaning behind the theme, I can actually pull out any one of these tools differently depending on what type of character I now have to design. And now we can start doing iterations. And so I didn't get very far with this guy because I was thinking we might do a demo at the end and push one of these characters. Um, that I liked the idea of kind of pushing on some of the character is lantern-jawed hero, but there's also this sort of incompetent quality. You know, he's not really 100% there. He's maybe a little bit too into himself and stuff like that. And in this case, you know, we can even pull in some of these toothpick in an egg motifs. They're still there, but you know, certain things like having like the thick neck and the kind of muscular chest and shoulders and stuff like that, where it didn't work with that, we can undercut them with other components and say, you know what if we made this feel really round and soft, the pectoral change? What if we made it so that the arms just felt like there's this kind of floppiness to them, instead of it feeling like strong bristling muscles, we get the sort of floppiness of the jacket. And of course, looking at his head, we have some of those strong components, but then we have like this crookedness going through his nose that pushes on this idea of, you know, it can be toughness, but it can also be like, yeah, he's gotten his nose broken a bunch. He's probably not that good of a fighter, right? So then we take the big hulking creature and kind of looking at some different components. If we were to go back to this list, you know, we can't do the tiny hands and feet like we could with the hero, but we can look at other things like wild asymmetry. We can look at unfocused eyes. We can look at a physique that's unsuited to the job. We can look for things that don't quite connect. Little brain, and you can see that I've pulled in all those elements to kind of push the theme here. Even the decision where I went from, you know, these are just some other gorilla's arm and is kind of Frankenstein together from another gorilla. I thought, what if he actually has components that are less effective than actually just leaving the gorilla arms on or using gorilla arms? And I think, you know, it works pretty well to say, you know, okay, yes, this character, if he's going to attack somebody or be kind of a threat while this guy, you know, shakes and quivers, he'll still feel like a threat, but he's going to feel like he's not as much of a threat as he was actually made to be. He was meant to. He had the potential to be a greater threat, and now he isn't as much of a threat. And you, of course, can see the floppy egg things kind of showing up again, and the occasional almost toothpick-like thing. But this character doesn't really use the toothpick at all. We used it a little bit here. We don't use it at all here, and yet it still communicates the same idea and is starting to lean towards feeling like it fits into the same style. So that's how I would answer that question of how do you apply a theme to keep different designs in the same style. All right, so that's it. That's how to design with theme in a nutshell. I would like to give you the option whether you want to ask questions now, or if you want a demo, or if we want to try and do both at the same time. So I'm going to check the comments now and let me know if you have questions, and I will be happy to answer them. There's a little bit of a delay in the stream, so I'll try to get to the questions as I can. I'll wait. It'll be a minute before your questions start showing up if you have them. And if you don't have questions, I'll just dive right in. Yeah, there's a question here that was maybe posted earlier saying, so design first, then mold it into the theme. And I think that is really the best. That really is the best thing. So do the, you know, I'm pausing, I'm hesitating here because I have seen situations where you'll come up with a theme and it'll just start spinning ideas out. And I say, like, go with the thing that's easy. If something's working, run with it. Don't try to fight against it. And if you think themes are going to make, some specific theme is going to get you excited and get you drawing, go for it. But otherwise, I'd say your general process is going to be design. Do iterations, try to figure out. And when something starts working, then you take a step back and say, yeah, now let's figure out our theme. And you can go through the tools that I showed. Okay, question here saying, how do you apply theme in a more realistic environment and architecture? Okay, yeah, that's a great idea. So it's a great question. So let's talk a little bit about that. And I'm going to swap out. Let's go to Photoshop. Make sure that you can see what I'm doing here. Getting some problem here with it's because I turned off my feed instead of Photoshop. Okay, now we should be able to go and see Photoshop. Yeah, so going to theme in live action. Now I've never actually done live action design, so there will be better people to ask about this and how you would apply this. So I'll just give the best answer that I've got, but let's swap out for something I can draw with here. So if you're designing for live action, like say a creature, so if you're going to make something in animation and you want to give them kind of this squarish quality, right? You want to give them a big forehead, squarish features, whatever, right? So that becomes the idea number one, is how this kind of squarish character is working. So all right, that works pretty well for animation, but when you go to live action, you obviously, that's going to look stupid. You can't do that. So if you're going to design a live action character, like I said, I'm not that good at this sort of thing, so I'm just going to do my best. I'm going to still try to pull from some of these components that are going on, and I'm going to take things like the ear, and I'm just going to try to round that corner a little bit and maybe just introduce a couple corners in there without necessarily breaking the sort of live action proportions that you should be getting. You can still do a heavy brow, but I don't know if we can do a pure square. We can still introduce corners to try and push this live action quality. And we can actually do some pretty See, I've designed for games most of my life, so even as I'm trying to think of this as like live action, it's starting to end up just a little bit on the gamey side of things. So my apologies. My limitations in answering this question are going to prevent you from probably getting everything out of it that you would want to. But we're going to have to think a little bit more about the lips and how they fit in there. I usually will actually work out the structure first and then do the final drawing later. So that's kind of what I'm trying to do right now is I'm trying to think my way through that structure of the head, anticipating the fact that I'm going to be doing something a little bit different if I were to spend more time with this, although I don't know if I'm going to really push that far. I just want to get far enough to really answer the question. And even though, so this is where that idea of the lesser is to the greater is the greater is to the whole is so important because you don't always know what to do when you get into something like the lips when everything here is squarish, when the idea is squarish. By the way, I would recommend starting with this, like go crazy first and then try to figure out how to transition it into a different style. I think that's an awesome way to go. Anyway, so I'm just going to take this. We're going to try and get those lips kind of turning down, keep that cheek, I mean the lower lip kind of jutting out a little bit. Again, I like to think a lot about structure before I really dive into the final drawing. So that's kind of what you're seeing with those almost, they're almost like, I can't think of the word right now, uh, like a mesh, right? Like a model mesh, a 3D model mesh. Wireframe, that's the word I was trying to think of. That's what happens when you go live with something. It's sometimes difficult to think of stuff in the moment. Anyway, so in the end, it's like our character is going to have a lot of different things. But yeah, this idea of self-similarity, or the lesser is the greater is the whole that I started to introduce earlier, as it relates to this. It's like you don't always get the option to do, squarish nostrils, but you can think about angularity. And again, kind of going back to the idea of theme, right? Why did you go with that? Is it to get a sense of toughness? Is it against get a sense of immobility? Are you trying to get a sense of, I don't know, just someone who's like particularly dense intelligence wise? Because whatever thing you decide there, that's going to change the way you interpret this. And I probably should have gone there first to say, like, okay, what's the theme? How's this going? Because, if that character is going to have like a soft chin underneath, it's like you might be able to get a little bit of squarishness just out of rounding those corners and then flattening it in the middle. That can work, but ultimately it's like you're that works pretty well if you're going to go with a character that's going to feel tough, but I don't know if it feels immovable in the same way, right? We might actually need to make it so that the character has a little bit of a tighter structure around the jawline to get that, like, wall that will never get past sort of feeling. All right, I'm going to stop working on this because, like I said, live action's not my thing, but I did my best to try to answer that question. Let's go back here and see what other questions we got. All right. Yeah, can you apply this similarly to environments, architecture, and props? Yes, definitely. That's what makes it great, is because you can apply it to anything, anything. Then Sarah Connor says, do you usually start with a theme in mind, like the sample with up, or with the design that you build the theme off of? Yeah, I already answered that one, but yeah, don't. I would say generally don't start with a theme in mind, but if it gets you somewhere good, go for it. All right. How do how to do themes in a way that isn't overdone or too heavy-handed. Do you advise on balance? I don't think that you can really do uh, themes too much if you're understanding what the message is, right? If you know what message you're trying to tell really well, then you can't really push it too far. The only restraining thing on that is going to be, so I'm talking about that as just kind of a broad principle, like go for it, just run crazy with the themes. But the style and the type of world that you're creating is going to dictate what's appropriate as an expression of that theme. So, for example, just like we were talking about with live action, you can't go absolutely mad with uh, you know, the structure of the face and have it remain viable as a live action design. You can't do that. And so we may have to find other expressions of theme in that design, other symbols of immobility. But it's like, if you're doing it right, if you understand what you're trying to say, it can't be overdone. If you're just doing motifs, you can overdo motifs for sure. But if you're just looking at messaging, I don't think you can do too much. I honestly think the main reason why productions that are thinking about theme and they're trying to push theme, the reason why they don't do more with it is just because it's too expensive. Sometimes people don't do it because they're not thinking about it, and in that case, they're just not leveraging the power of theme. But most of the time, it's just an issue of that yeah, it's just too expensive to be thinking about every single thing there. I did mean to say, by the way, theme does decrease the cost for some things. Like all the stuff that I showed you, it was like several iterations in. Usually, to design a character, you have to do dozens of iterations to get where you really want to go. And on the characters that I was working on for this, it was 6 iterations in. I was starting to get something because I moved immediately to try and answering good questions about theme. So can a theme be further pushed by interacting the shapes in a certain way with each other? Yes, and I'll try and demo that now. Um, I'd love to see you build a theme and then build a character or a pair of characters around it. Uh, that takes a little bit of time. I'll try and show you how that works as I kind of extrapolate from an existing theme, and I'm going to try and bring a character's own theme into it. Question: how do you proceed with the character design when you already have a written story with a specific theme? So usually the visual theme is an expression of the story theme. Usually it's an expression of the story theme, but it doesn't have to be a one-to-one comparison of the story theme. You're going to bring in other visual influences and references and stuff like that to make it more exciting. Um, but yeah, when you already have a specific story theme, it's not a hindrance. It should actually be a benefit. You should be able to lean into the story theme to decide what visual symbols will help tell that story theme again. Um, can you define theme again? So theme is just the visual ideas. So theme, as we're talking about it, is the visual ideas that make something communicate the ideas that it's supposed to communicate. That's what a theme is. Okay, so let's get into demoing now. And I'm gonna actually work on that gorilla a bit more. So let me pull up my ref here. By the way, you should always work from reference. I'm not going to here just for the sake of time because we've only got 30 minutes about to demo this stuff. But I'm just going to show you how to take this further. And what I'm going to do here, because we've still got our theme on this is kind of, if I am remembering correctly, I've already forgotten what my own theme is. We have the incompetent or ineffective. That's kind of what it all adds up to, right? If we were talking about story theme, that is what we're talking about here, is the incompetence or ineffectiveness of the character is the main thing that we're looking at. But we were communicating that with various features that we talked about, right? The smallness of the hands, the small brain, the asymmetry, other things like that. Now, I think that's great, and I still want to do that. And I'm going to push a little bit further. I'm going to lean harder into incompetent and ineffective. But there's another component of theme, which is that you don't always have a single theme for the whole story. Sometimes an individual character is going to have a theme. And that's kind of what I want to look at here. We're going to take this gorilla character and say, okay, what's the theme of this character? And what I'm seeing here is kind of this brute quality, and then we've got this sort of the incompetent is the other side. So incompetent is kind of the other thing. Now you could make an argument for some other things. It's like, oh, he's brute and we have the technology. But the question is, can we take the technological component and drive every decision of the design? Because if you can't, then it's not really the theme, right? The technology is an element, and it's fine. Like that thing that I did with Brave, you could go say, hey, we kind of have this like sci-fi, turn of the century tech going on, um, or whatever it was later than turn of the century. But yeah, basically like the tech is a component. But does that actually plug into our two theme boxes up here? So here's our idea one, here's our idea two. Now, I think in this case, there's also some other ideas, right? We could pull from. We could say this sort of like stitching Frankenstein. And so before we say 100% what incompetent, that's it, there's a couple other elements that I want to look at. I think there's an element of danger that is more specific than just brute. It's like this is actually a character that is made to kind of destroy things and to do it effectively. And trying to think of anything else. We could look at the tech and what the tech is saying, which is kind of that this character is augmented. When you augment a character with tech, that's one way of augmenting them, but that augmentation is also happening with the sort of stitching and stuff like that. Now, when I look at this and I take this kind of idea cloud, I'm going to plug them into specific boxes. I think if we're going to say the stitching is actually part of the augmentation of the character, we're going to say that goes here. Augmented brute. And we're going to add a little bit of danger to this. We want a character that they're augmented in such a way that they are actually dangerous. So the incompetence is still there, right? And it's actually a major part of this theme. And so we're still going to keep that in the box because none of these things, none of the other elements really pushed into the incompetence box, right? The stitching, is it done incompetently? Well, no, not particularly. I mean, it kind of is, but is the technology, does it feel particularly incompetent? Well, no, not necessarily. And so the incompetent, now we have to look at what is the incompetence doing probably to this stuff. Or we have to look at what is this stuff doing to the incompetence of the character. My instincts say that we're going to be looking this direction for this theme. So we're going to be looking at our main idea is this kind of augmented dangerous brute. We have this augmented dangerous brute. Now, what is the incompetentness of the character doing to that? Is it undercutting? Or is it softening, right? Is it making it so that the character feels like it could be a friend or something, friend or foe, right? I kind of like that one. I'm going to run with that. So again, like I said, sometimes it'll be something you see in the designs you've done. Other times it'll be something where it's just like, okay, what do I want the incompetence to do here? It's there, but what should it do? And I actually like softening, so we'll keep that. Let's go ahead and we'll write that back in. Softening. And I'm going to actually wipe this stuff out because the stitching and the augmentation and the tech might be elements that we pull back in. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to push this character in both directions. So if we want to do an augmented dangerous brute, how do we push that idea as far as possible? I think the small head thing is cool, but the small head thing doesn't really push into something that feels dangerous and that pushes the brutishness unless we can actually pull that head off the body. So meaning like we're going to give him a neck. It's not just going to be a wall of stuff with a head sitting in front. We're actually going to pull that head out and make it so that he can do stuff with that neck. All right, then I like the idea of these sort of shoulders and the power, the gorilla shoulders and what they add, we're going to try and push that idea more in this design. And we'll push the brutishness of the belly here. And we can still have a brute with those smaller legs. So I think we can just leave that stuff as is. Now, are there other symbols that can represent this? Well, some of the ones that we're seeing here is we're seeing these kind of claw shapes, these sort of like angular, dangerous sort of shapes. We're seeing these sort of rectangular and trapezoidal shapes. And we're of course getting, yeah, just like any of the angles, any of the sort of like high energy directional stuff is going to be pushing on the danger side of it. Now, what's not really showing up here is the augmented, right? Is there any other way to show that the character is augmented other than just the stitching and that? Could we make it so this character feels like it's more powerful than it really ought to be, or it's able to do something special? Like, what if we were to turn this thing on its back into a laser beam, some kind of sci-fi thing that he can lean down and blast, and we'll still keep the vacuum tubes on there, but we're going to let them pop out this way and try and do something that has this sort of powerful weapon component to it. Get some venting going on there. And let's let that leg and foot kind of pop out there. I like the bear arm. I think that's going to be fun to play with. We can push that. All right, so that idea I think is working pretty well. Now we want to take that idea and we're going to want to soften it. We're going to want to take it and make it so that the character is now, we could say, is this friend, is it foe? And by the way, I would strongly recommend sketching like this. You see stuff all the time on Instagram and ArtStation that's all perfectly rendered, or you get this type of thing where, I spent a little bit of time trying to like figure out line weights and making the drawing look nicer. It's not the best way to design. It's what you do when you are happy with the design and you want to put a little bit of extra spit and polish on it. But this is a design. When you start kind of pushing on things, and by the way, I would want to get more detailed with that probably than I'm going to, but I think I'm actually going to get into the face for my softening. I'm going to try and push on the friend or foe component. I like the sort of skull shape that's happening. There's something dangerous in the skull face, which goes to this idea. But I think we need to find what's the sympathetic component. And I think the sympathetic is going to be in the eyes. This character just like a little bit sad about the fact that he's this kind of tortured beast. And maybe I can take some of these things and allow them to still kind of droop off one side and get the sort of floppy asymmetry. But this time with that expression, you can still get the little bit of snarled, a little bit of potential of danger, but now we're getting this sort of, I feel bad for this guy and what's been done to him sort of component. And I think instead of the Frankenstein head up there, I'm actually going to put like a light bulb up there. It's like his augmentation is to give him ideas. Maybe that will be the downfall, the thing that turns him against his master in the end. I think the sympathetic sort of soft ears might be another good thing to push in there. At this point, I'm not too worried about doing the right thing that gets all of this right. I'm trying to find what kind of softening, if the incompetence, because the incompetence is still there, right? But if the incompetence is softening the character and making us kind of feel a little bit bad for him, what does that look like, and how is that kind of different from the things that we've already got? So now that I've got that head kind of working, now let's put it back on a body. And I think I'll keep the head just a little bigger. Well, maybe not. Let's let the head be small in comparison to that body, because I want this body to feel just massive. And then any shots where you need to get that sympathy, you can get back in on the face. All right. So now let's look at it at the large level. If we're going to say, all right, we've got the big augmented brute sort of quality. Oh, I should turn this a little bit. Before we do any of that, let me rotate this head just a little, because I want to draw his body off to the side and get some of the dimensionality going on there. We can decide specific structures to kind of help support this idea of this guy. And I think I'm going to push the back of the head back a little bit. It's nice. It's always fine to design in a sort of diagrammatic or picking a view and drawing that. There's nothing wrong with that. But in the end, a design has got to be something that's, can be, you can do a turnaround from it. You know exactly what's going on there. So I always like to explore that stuff as I go. I don't think I'll make that go out again. We're just going to make it jut up. Almost like you got a bonk on the head. Which I've done before with monkey characters with cyborg implants, so maybe it's an overdone idea, but I still like it, even though maybe it's overdone. Okay, we'll still get the sort of like dark around the eyes, make it so that you're unclear whether he's friend or foe. Has he had enough sleep, or is he, done some things in his life that are now reflecting in his face? Going kind of back to that idea from Rembrandt that a person's soul is kind of projected on their countenance. The history of their life is shown. All right, so now we got a head in there. Now I'm just gonna make this stuff smaller so that I can explore that body around it. I know that I said this could be done with environments, and I'm not going to demonstrate that, even though I love working with environments, but I've been thinking mostly about these characters and kind of how to apply theme there. So feel free to ask questions or even reach out to me on social media if you want clarification on how to do this in other ways. All right, I think I want to soften this guy and maybe even push the incompetence of the ends of those limbs. So we still have the big long limbs, but we're getting kind of this softer quality now. And I like the sort of fun, the little like tiny torso, fat belly thing. So I think I'm going to push back to that, just because I think it's more interesting than the sort of generic giant brute body. And I think I want to keep this character kind of in the same style as the scientist that we got. So we'll still go big with that arm. But maybe this one will go big with the shoulder. But we'll actually go a little thinner before it goes down again. Maybe we can go thinner with these hands. I like the sort of like rhinoceros elephant foot thing going on this side, so we're going to try and keep that. And on this side, I was thinking bear claws is kind of what was going on there. We'll make them kind of soft, friendly bear claws, not too, still dangerous, but again, kind of pushing on that friend versus foe thing. I think it can be a little bit crazier. When you're going to do repeating elements like this, find the shape that they fit in. That's important, because otherwise those details will get away from you and you'll be fighting against them instead of them helping you in your design work. pull that backpack thing up, and we'll try and put our like super weapon coming out of it. And the vacuum tubes, I'm going to push them back a little bit more. I want to keep this character simple overall. All right, I'm going to go and check the comments real quick to see if there's any other questions so that I can talk about them while I go here. Let's see. Okay, question. How long do themes take to be decided during big studio projects, and usually who are involved in deciding the final theme? Okay, so it's interesting because I've worked on teams where people have actively resisted attempts to come up with a theme. They thought it was kind of a stupid thing to even think about it, and um, and so I'll just quietly do it in the background. I'll just think about it as a tool for myself rather than being a studio thing. I've worked for studios that are really open to the idea, but they weren't thinking about it. Where, one time I was talking with the director at a studio, and they were describing to me all the stuff that they wanted their visuals to be about. And then, I spent a minute just kind of figuring it out. And I said, oh, it sounds like your visual theme is this. And I gave them a sentence. And they're like, oh, great, that's perfect. And, they were happy to have it. They just didn't know to look for it. And what was interesting is they actually had a visual theme already. They just weren't using terms that you would think of to describe a visual theme or describe it as a visual theme. And then, of course, I've worked at places that have just been, that's the thing. They tell you up front what kind of feeling they're going for and what kind of visual elements they want to see with it. And, that's great when that happens because it just allows you to work. And that's that, right? So, as far as like when studios do it, I don't know. It's like I know that there are some studios that do story themes straight up front. I think it's less common to do a visual theme. Um, to do an explicit visual theme, but a lot of the art teams will actually kind of in their own efforts come up with visual themes to support the work that they're doing. So I think this is hopefully a tool that you can just think about on your own and how to apply it, um, rather than depending on the studio to tell you to do it. You just say, I want to have a theme here and I'm going for it. And you don't even have to tell them explicitly if they're not interested in it. Like I said, there's no reason why you have to be working with others on the theme. If it works for people and it makes them excited about it, go for it. If it doesn't make them excited, don't worry about it. All right, so at this point, I'm just going to go to color. And the reason why I'm going to go to color is because I really, really want you to understand how theme can apply in other areas. So theme is not just about the drawing and the shapes, but it can actually be applied through everything. So swapping out a brush here. Trying to decide what's going to be my favorite brush to use for this type of thing. Let's do this guy. And just given the style of the world that this is coming from, in fact, I'm going to pull this guy out here so that we have him as reference as well. And by the way, I could push the theme much further on this guy. I'm not going to right now just for the sake of time, because I want to spend the time in the best way I can. One of the things that I would do is I would also think about camera. And right now this is a down shot. We're looking down on the guy and it makes him feel smaller, less imposing, stuff like that. I think if I were to do a little bit more design work, I would definitely make camera more of a thing and make it more of an upshot, but we're not going to do that. I'm going to put a multiply layer on this and we're going to start carving out chunks of color. I'm deliberately using something that has a little bit of texture so that I don't get too caught up in anything, but I'm just thinking about how to solve the problem that we have to solve here. I'm going to make it so that there's a little butt poking out there. because it's funny, it fits the style, and it makes the character feel just a little bit incompetent. I wouldn't just do that as by default, but it's like this character, it kind of demands that because it's a gorilla, and that's how gorillas, their stance just kind of pops that butt out. So we're going to use it. All right, next up, let's get his skin tones, and I'm going to use maybe like a darkish yellow with some splotches in it. Thinking about some chimpanzees that I've seen. I don't know if that's a thing that gorillas get, but we're gonna hope it works out. That's kind of my artistic philosophy in general. People that know me have heard me say it lots of times, but it's just like dive in and see what happens and then figure it out after the fact. It's a great way to get things done. I love to think about things. I love to figure out problems, but you can't start with the problem. You can't start by thinking that you have to think. You need to be thinking first and foremost about how do I tell the story, and just do your best in trying to tell that story, and then after the fact take a step back and think. That said, some of you are going to be planners and it'll be your default to push on these things kind of ahead of times. Maybe you even start with the theme, and I want to throw that out there just as an important thing for you to understand, that it's not always going to be there isn't a right way of doing this. I'm not suggesting that you should always approach theme second. Sometimes it's first. For you, it's first. It works best for you that way. And sometimes theme is last. I've seen that work as well, where you just have something compelling and it evolves organically and naturally, and you don't want to force theme on it. And then when you're taking it to an outside studio to do all the outsourcing, that's the point where you have to say, okay, what did we make here, and now what's our theme? Now that we've actually got this thing created, and I think that's a great way to go. To just say, let's go with the flow. The thing that helps us achieve what we want. That's the ideal way to create. Said that I want these to be soft, so we're just going to make them a little bit overstuffed, padded sort of claws on there. Maybe go back to the floppy egg sort of feeling that we got from our original character here. All right, and then our elephant leg will go gray, maybe a little bit of a grayish blue there. Or rhinoceros leg, I guess. Elephant legs are their elbows or knees kind of look like that. The joints, but I think I'm doing something that's more of just like a giant, I don't know, pachyderm-like animal rather than being something you could specifically reference. Again, getting actual reference would probably be a good idea here. We're not doing it just for the sake of time, but it would actually make everything better if I was thinking that way. I like this sort of blue color for the text, so we're going to pull that in here. Just realized that the lines should be on top of the scene. Then I can turn multiply off on both these and just paint. If I know I'm going to be using one layer, then I'll use multiply, but in this case I think this will work. All right, so color scheme. I've just been kind of going with my gut on color scheme, but it's time to ask the question, what does this theme mean for the color scheme? So if we go back to this, right, we want a character that feels like this dangerous augmented brute. So is there something we can do with the colors that softens the character, that makes the character feel softened, and specifically softened in a direction of incompetence? So we're not just going that we want this character to be friendly, but we actually do want to kind of undercut what the character is all about, undercut the brutishness with that. And what I'm going to do here sure that we can get a little bit of the light on the tech here. We're going to bring the same idea down here onto the head. I'm not really worried about light and shadow, but I want to make sure that things are readable kind of up front. And let's do our light bulb on his head. And I wonder, can we use a light bulb color that makes him feel like he's just not that tough? And maybe a green is the way to go. Green makes him feel like it's like a stop-go sort of thing. And I think that might be a good component to pull in. And then the other thing I'm wondering about to bring softness in here is what if we just use like a pink, like a fleshy pink on his face? Something that just takes away, kind of undercuts that idea of this kind of angry, scary brute. We might still have some scary, brutish things to put in here, like some liver spots or what. I don't know if they're liver spots. It's probably like liver spots. I've seen it on chimpanzees a lot. That's kind of where I was thinking with that. And I think with his eyes, let's go back to the dangerous. We're going to make it so that the core of these eyes feels like he is going to be powerful. And I'm going to sink those eyes in here. So again, don't worry too much about shadow at this point, but it won't hurt to add something in there for the sake of clarity. And now in the eyes, I'm going to go with like a blue pupil. Maybe really soft for this one, because it feels like that one, it's like a eye that is dead or something. And then on this one, we're going to take that and we're going to go kind of darker bluish gray. And now that I've done this, it's like I'm not sure. Maybe he needs a little bit more of a sympathetic thing going on in this eye, rather than just being kind of the scary scarred eye sort of feeling. I'm going to go inside that mouth now. And we'll get some of the yellow in the teeth. Now I've demonstrated a little bit just how to get the colors and the textures all to kind of work together. But we haven't talked that much about texture, and I think that would be kind of the next thing. It's like, how does the texture of this ape now reflect this theme? Let me just darken the rings under his eyes a little bit. Then we'll get just a little soft pink at the cheek. And hopefully you're starting to see this emerge, what I was talking about this whole time. Just this idea of like the character is this big mean brute, but we're just softening it. And it might actually be too much. I'm thinking I might back off a little bit in some of this softening, get this character feeling a little more dangerous again, even in the face. But we'll get started with it. With something else. So with the hair, right? So we're going to have opportunities for texture here. So if we go with the original design, you could say, well, let's just pick up that motif and run around with it. And we saw as we were kind of dissecting that one, that danger was one of the things that comes out with that. But I'm wondering, can the texture be an expression of this theme, right? Can the fur texture itself actually be an expression of the incompetence softening, that sort of brutish, dangerous thing? And I think it's possible. So let's try it. I'm just going to go, maybe we'll go to like a silverback gray back here. And I'm going to start trying to find shapes here that communicate. Maybe we just get a little bit of that dangerousness, but maybe we're also pushing like a softness with this. Like we just round those corners ever so slightly, so that even looking at his fur, you get this this squarish kind of powerful thing, but it's not 100% all about the power. It's just a little bit about the fact that he's kind of a big pushover. Might look scary. He's built to be scary. His role is to be scary, but there's just something a tiny bit softer and easier going. And maybe I could even make it so the texture itself, not just the shapes, but the texture has a softness to it. So I might break that up a little bit. Now, with that said, I need to make this point that this feels like something that was designed maybe for like TV animation a little bit. And it skews that way. This is definitely not leaning right now towards TV animation. I'm getting too many textural shifts and stuff like that. But I think it's okay. Just think of this as an iteration. I can easily take this through a simplification pass after the fact. So I'm not too worried about that. Let me get sort of the effective, dangerous component of his arm there. And we'll cover that up a little bit. So a lot of this arm hair I'm just going to allow to blend in, but we may occasionally bring out a little bit of that texture again, just so that you can feel that idea looking at the design. You don't have to know what the theme is, but you can just kind of see like, oh yeah, this guy's soft. It's just a little softer than what appearances, first impressions are saying about him. We're running out of time. Just a few more minutes here, so I just want to make sure that any other questions that are being asked get answered, and if not, I will just kind of keep doodling till it's over. Okay, so the question here is, can you bias details or contrast in certain areas of the character to push theme? And the answer is yes. You can bias details and contrast to push theme, and that's exactly what I'm trying to do here. I'm just trying to make it so that the texture here does that. If I did something like this with the elephant, maybe an elephant's texture is going to look kind of like this hard, cracked, rough skin. Well, what if I could get kind of a dry, cracked, rough skin sort of feeling, but with softer shapes? Because it's already brutish, right? That we're already getting that idea here. So what if I just used soft, rounded shapes here instead? And they don't have to be high contrast. They can be pretty subtle. And once you've kind of discovered what you want there, it's fairly easy to start applying that elsewhere. You can take this all down to here and do the same thing again. Gonna do just like a little bit of a baboon thing back there, but maybe not all the way. We'll just get a hint of that going on there. We're gonna mostly just try and push the silverback gorilla sort of thing going down through there. All right, so now we're at a point where we could start pushing details, and once you start getting into the details, when you get into the line art, all that stuff, it really does need to support the big idea still. And so don't lose sight of that. Make sure you're going back to the theme as you finish things off. trying to put in some kind of component that pushes the idea that this character is being strapped in there. And I think I want to get a little bit more of that death ray feeling here, so the character does feel dangerous in the end, even in the augmentation of the character. Maybe I'll even use a dark color just so it feels like that is, he may not be effective in many other ways, but he's got his death ray. But then I'm just going to undercut that just ever so slightly by making it so that the death ray has some asymmetry to the shapes that make it up. Kind of getting the floppy egg toothpick thing, just undercutting it ever so slightly. I like that idea. Okay. All right. We are just about done here. I will kind of put one last plug in there for just you should be thinking about theme. This is not just an issue of it makes stories better or whatever, which that by itself is a reason to really use this tool as much as you can, but because it actually makes your process easier. It's so much easier instead of iterating randomly and stuff just arbitrarily working or not working. You are working according to just something that makes sense. You're figuring out how the character works. And I know there's a little bit of randomness up front, but it doesn't take that many iterations in, as evidenced by the guy at the beginning that I drew, that I was showing you how to design. You don't have to put a lot of thought into it up front for it to start making sense and becoming something kind of awesome. But you do have to fairly early in the process at least start asking some of these questions. So, all right, I think that is it. Thank you everybody for attending, and that's all.